Welcome to the extended version of this lesson on the antagonist. We just covered what an antagonist is and what antagonistic forces are, as well as how to make them more effective by increasing their power and ensuring you don't create an unmotivated villain. Now we're going to talk about how your antag is related to your theme, a secret to giving your antag a compelling desire, and an in-depth breakdown of 2016's coming-of-age dramedy, The Edge of 17. Let's start with how your antag is related to your theme. We're going to spend a whole lesson talking about themes soon, but to summarize, your theme is like the lesson your story is exploring. It's very internal and linked with the B story, and it's what your story is actually about. So where does the antag fit in? Well, one way you can think about your protag and your antag is as a battle of ideas. When we watch two people competing with each other and one wins, what we're really seeing is that one way of doing things is better than another way of doing things. If your protag wins, then you are telling the audience that if they want success, they should act in the way your protag acted, not how your antag acted. And this will help reinforce your theme. If the lesson you're trying to get across is that cheaters never prosper, then one way you can approach your protag and antag is by making your antag a cheater and showing them, not prospering. Essentially, the idea of cheating is represented by your antag, and the idea of not cheating is represented by your protag. And your story is about those two ideas battling it out. Whichever way is shown winning will be the value trumpeted by your theme. There's another way of doing this, and that's by giving your protag and antag the same flaw. If they are both suffering from the same problems, because they're both suffering from the same flaw, then you can highlight how important the need is. Show your protag finding their need and overcoming their flaw, ideally after an epiphany, but don't do the same for your antag. Then show your protag succeeding and your antag failing. To go off the last example, make both your protag and antag cheaters. However, your protag has an epiphany and finds their need of integrity. Then in the final part of your story, your protag succeeds and your antag fails. This is a clear way of delivering your message of cheaters never prosper. This brings us to our secret trick for giving your antag a compelling desire. This is surprisingly obvious, but until you think about it consciously, you're missing out on some huge untapped potential. So here it is. If you want to give your antag a compelling desire, give them the same goal as your protag. So many great stories do this. In romances, what better antag is there than another suitor? Why? Because they have the same goal as the protag, namely the love interest, like in She's Out of My League. Or sports movies. Of course the best antag is going to be a rival or another team because they have the same goal as the protag, namely to win the competition, like in Rocky. And even if it's not exactly the same, it can be two sides of the same coin. For example, in most survival of the fittest movies like Predator, the goal of the protag is to kill the antag, while the goal of the antag is to kill the protag. Even a detective movie like Who Framed Roger Rabbit is centered around the crime. The antag wants to get away with it, while the protag wants them to be caught. So remember, if you want your antag's desire to be compelling, the fastest way is to give them the same goal as your protag. Now, let's see the antagonist in action with our in-depth example.
The Edge of 17 is a 2016 coming-of-age comedy that follows Nadine, an insecure high schooler, as she grapples with her lifelong best friend dating her older brother. We've chosen this story because it exemplifies how to make the protag their own antag, since most of Nadine's problems come from her own flaw of self-loathing. To start, you could argue that Nadine's older brother or mother are the antags of the piece, and they do provide some conflict. But when you actually look at what stands in the way of Nadine and her goal of getting a boyfriend, most of the conflict comes from Nadine's self-sabotaging. For example, when Nadine's mother drives her to work, it's only because Nadine refuses to get out of the car. And she refuses to get out of the car for fear of being seen by her ex-best friend, Krista, which is a problem created by her flaw of self-loathing. In similar stories with clear antags, like Sack in Wedding Crashers, the antag usually attacks the hero directly at the 3/4 mark, like how Sack reveals protag John's secret to Claire, ending their potential romance. When you look at this moment in The Edge of 17, it's actually Nadine herself who sends a graphic message to Nick, her crush, and then gets upset when Nick tries to get physical in his car. Nadine is performing the actions of the antag herself, becoming the very thing standing between herself and her goal. Here's one last clear example of how to make a protag's flaw flare up and cause them problems. Nadine's flaw is self-loathing, brought up near the start of the movie when she expresses horror at having to live with herself for the rest of her life. Soon after, Nadine confronts Krista for leaving her at a party to play beer pong with Nadine's brother's friends. Because Nadine is self-loathing, she needs others around so she isn't stuck with herself, and she feels threatened that Krista is making other friends. So, with her flaw flaring up, Nadine demands Krista choose between herself and her brother. When Krista doesn't, Nadine pushes Krista away, a byproduct of her flaw. This also notably pushes Nadine further from her want, which is connection, exemplified by feeling like she needs a boyfriend so she doesn't have to be alone with herself. Stories with no clear antag are the toughest to crack, so hopefully this example shows a much more difficult scenario than most of the stories you'll explore. If you're looking for a more clear-cut protag and antag relationship, check out Die Hard. Most of the conflict protag John McClane faces is directly because of antag Hans Gruber and his henchmen, and that's a pretty standard protag/antag relationship.
We hope this example showcases how a hero's flaw can be so powerful it becomes the central antagonist of a story. You should also now have a better understanding of how a protag and antag are representations of a battle of ideas, and the usefulness of assigning the antag the same flaw or goal as your protag. To end this lesson, here's a great quote on antags. The greater the monster, the greater the hero. Without strong antagonistic forces, your hero probably won't be very heroic. Put your protag through hell. And that brings us to the end of this mini-course. Now that you understand how to craft an incredible protag, we're going to jump into some story theory that will split your story in two and help you double its power. We can't wait to see you there.